Two Israeli strikes in Beirut and Tehran reshuffle cards of conflicts with Hamas and Hezbollah. Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh was killed in Tehran on Wednesday, earlier today, in an operation attributed to Israel by Iran. Earlier, Israel had claimed responsibility for a strike in Beirut against Fuad Shukr, a Hezbollah commander. It looks like Netanyahu is doing everything in his power to incite not a regional conflict, but a regional conflagration. For insight into this, let's turn to our first guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Armed Struggle: Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So over the course of one night, two high-level killings carried out from a distance in two capitals, Beirut and Tehran. The first late Tuesday, July 30th, was carried out by Israeli fighter jets and targeted 62-year-old Fuad Shukr, one of Hezbollah's most senior military officials based in Lebanon. And then shortly before 8 p.m. Yesterday, several strikes hit the top floor of an apartment building in the southern suburbs of Beirut, a Hezbollah stronghold, destroying part of the building. Dr. Horne, again, one of the things that comes to my mind is these are occurring just after Netanyahu left Washington. And I think it was more important in his mind to talk to Joe Biden and Vice President Harris, telling them what he was about to do, as opposed to his speech before Congress. Your thoughts, Dr. Gerald Horne?
Well, that's a reasonable inference indeed on your part. Likewise, since we are talking about Washington or system, we should also mention what we've noted a number of times previously. That is to say that Mr. Netanyahu seems to be taken and bedazzled by the nostrum of late Pentagon Chief Donald Rumsfeld, which is that if you have a problem, the way to deal with that problem is to enlarge it, because that introduces new dynamics. Because Israel obviously is facing a dire existential battle. A good deal of northern Israel has been abandoned because of rockets raining down from southern Lebanon. We see that there is internal strife in light of the High Court in Israel ruling that the ultra-Orthodox can be conscripted. And then the cherry on top of the cake is that Mr. Netanyahu himself has a material interest in keeping the pot boiling, because if the pot is not boiling, he most likely will have to face the music and perhaps endure a stint behind bars. You should also infer that these recent assassinations in Tehran and in Lebanon are an indication that Mr. Netanyahu is not taking the question of the Israeli detainees seriously. We had been led to believe that the detainees, we have been told, that were seized by Hamas on October 7th were a prime concern of the Israeli authorities. But obviously that's not the case, because this assassination roundabout that we've just had is going to jeopardize their continued existence. You also reasonably infer that Mr. Netanyahu discussed these reckless actions during his recent visit to Washington, where he was cheered on when he spoke before Congress, and of course received a pat on the back from Mr. Trump in Mar-a-Lago. This should be of ultimate concern to we in the United States, because we should recognize that the two oceans, the Atlantic and the Pacific, that have been perceived as impregnable barriers preventing the mainland, the homeland, from being attacked, that's hardly the case in 2024, as the events of September 11, 2001 tended to suggest. In that regard, let me point your audience to an article in the July 29th, 2024 edition of The New Yorker by Dexter Filkins. He makes a to-do in his detailing of his journey into Lebanon and having discussions with high-level Lebanese officials. He makes a to-do about the fact that there is a substantial Lebanese diaspora, not least in this hemisphere, not least on the triple border, the border that brings together Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay. He mentions in passing the bombing of Israeli and, in fact, pro-Zionist structures in Buenos Aires. The anniversary is recently marked by President Milei. He does not talk about the fact that there is a substantial Lebanese diaspora in particular, not far distant from these shores. The president of El Salvador, for example, President Bukele, who, to be fair, is a U.S. ally, is of Arab descent, as is the fact that there is this substantial Lebanese and Arab comprador class in Haiti, in the Caribbean, and in general. One does not have to read between the lines of Mr. Filkin's article to suggest that if Mr. Netanyahu continues on his reckless course and evidence emerges that he received an okay from Washington, that activated in this hemisphere could be a network of pro-Beirut forces that can make life very difficult for Washington indeed. And speaking of which, we should also recognize that Mr. Netanyahu is making life difficult for Washington, not least because the International Criminal Court is making his life difficult. And I should mention in this context that the newly installed Prime Minister of Great Britain, Sir Keir Starmer, has withdrawn objections to the ICC attempt to pursue Mr. Netanyahu. We have been apprised, as you know, of the International Court of Justice opinion recently rendered, suggesting the illicit, illegal, improper nature of Israeli settlements on the West Bank. We know that in recent days in Beijing, you had a mediation effort that worked out successfully, bringing together not only Hamas and Fatah and the Palestinian Authority leaders, but also about a dozen other different formations from historic Palestine. And so Mr. Netanyahu, in surveying the scene, looking at the ICJ, the ICC, and the Beijing mediation, has decided, I take it, to throw the dice because he feels that events are not necessarily going in his favor. But he needs to recognize that the situation could easily worsen for Israel, that is to say, because we expect a very harsh reaction from the Iranian authorities in particular, an attack on their capital as a new leader was being inaugurated and installed. This is a punch in the nose. It's a slap in the face. I expect Iran to respond appropriately. We should also expect their allies, including in Baghdad, Iraq, to respond appropriately. There are still U.S. soldiers there who are sitting ducks, who are hundreds, if not thousands, of targets that could be easily, quote, pressured, unquote. Speaking of pressure, expect the same on U.S. allies, that is Jordan. Also, keep in mind that with the reconciliation that's in motion between Turkey and Syria, you can expect that particular duo, speaking of Ankara and Damascus, not to be indifferent to this Israeli aggression, as evidenced by the fact that President Erdogan of Turkey has already issued thinly veiled threats with regard to Israel. And I should say that Mr. Hania of Hamas, killed in Tehran, one of his chief supporters has been Ankara precisely. This Israeli aggression is going to put enormous pressure on Egypt. President al-Sisi is going to put enormous pressure on the Saudis, who before October 7th were thought to be moving towards some sort of entente with Israel. Now, we should also mention that a so-called cause of this Israeli aggression was this killing of Druze in the illegally occupied Golan Heights, illegally occupied by Israel, that is. Although, according to Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, the former chief aide to Colin Powell, it's not clear if Hezbollah was responsible for these deaths. He suggests that it might have been a malfunction of the heralded Iron Dome system, and it might have been a self-inflicted wound, perhaps accidentally, perhaps not, by the Israelis themselves. The Israeli authorities also need to recognize that they too are vulnerable. In the Filkins article aforementioned, a Hezbollah leader mentions that they can target Mr. Netanyahu himself in his bedroom, just like the leader of Hamas was targeted in his bedroom. We know that the Iranians are in the forefront of what is called the revolutionary and military affairs. That is to say, the construction of cheap drones. They are in the vanguard of this. We all saw the pictures of Hezbollah drones that took intimate pictures of very sensitive Israeli sites within the last few weeks, including military bases, nuclear plants, all, of course, of concern to the Israeli authorities. And with regard to this conflict widening, the comrades in North Africa have good reason to think that that might be the course that they're being faced with. You know that we have been talking in recent days about how France has moved against the interests of Algeria and Western Sahara in league with Morocco, a signatory to the Trump-induced Abraham Accords. And there is a suspicion that perhaps if there is a widening of this conflict, it won't necessarily be happenstance, it won't necessarily be accidental, that perhaps, as evidenced by your suggestion that Mr. Netanyahu conferred with Mr. Biden and Mr. Trump and getting the okay before launching these assassinations, that perhaps France is in on the deal as well. In other words, we may be in the middle of yet more so-called forever wars. We may be in the middle of conflagrations, the likes of which we have not seen in years. And in fact, Mr. Netanyahu indeed may have opened the gates of hell.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis. And we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.